Well, it's pretty much already a wrap. One Piece is on the verge of outselling Superman and becoming the best-selling comic of all time. Rightfully deserved. This has been going on for 30 years now. Exceedingly high-quality content. You're talking about one of the best stories ever told. Probably up there with one of the finest pieces of literature ever. And I'm not really exaggerating when I say that because, obviously I read a lot. Obviously, I'm like very well aware of like what's out there and like what people enjoy and what qualifies as good storytelling and good world building. One Piece, I would say, far outstrip something like, say, Lord of the Rings when it comes to like overall quality. All right. Way more in-depth world building, crazy plot twists, all these revelations. It is just so good at what it does. It is far beyond, I think, what any of us could ever hope to accomplish. But, on top of that, though, it's also kind of dominated the Western comic book industry as well. On top of One Piece's literary accomplishments, it's also, a comic, which also means that by its nature, it really should be seen as being better than American and especially European comics. But right now, we're kind of in this weird phase where like every hipster, contrarian dipshit has been trying to tell you that like, oh yeah, manga's not that relevant, it's not that popular, nobody cares about it. Completely delusional. Like this is like a straight up boomer take right out of the 90s. Like manga's been getting more and more popular every year because of just how awful the Western and Europe comic book industry has become. Right? One Piece is like probably the defining example of that, but there's definitely other series that have also done very well for themselves over here. Naruto, I think, is like the most watched anime on Netflix. You have series like Dragon Ball, Demon Slayer, which I haven't read. I'm reading Full Metal Alchemist right now, and it's kind of dawning on me just how good this series actually is. You look at stuff like Attack on Titan, which is probably the most like prescient, politically relevant title, ever. White genocide is real. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the manga industry and why it's stomping Western comic books. But like to put it in like the simplest possible way, it is because it's better. When I watched like the heavily censored cut down version of One Piece on Cartoon Network back in the day, the one that everyone hates, like even then you could tell just how much better this show was than its Western counterparts because it still tackled stronger issues. It still had better animation. It still had better scenarios, better character building. It had better plots. It had better twists. The characters more engaging. Like, it's shocking how much better one episode of One Piece was than anything else that was on TV at the time. And I was saying this right from the get-go that I was obsessed with One Piece. I love One Piece, and nobody around me knew anything about it. Like they would sneer at me and then go and just kind of sit slack-jawed, drooling, watching the Super Bowl. You know what I mean? That's the reality. That's the level of intelligence we're dealing with here. People who just don't even try and discover new things, who don't even watch the things they talk about, people who just want to sit and do nothing for hours on end. That is our opposition here, because we've been telling people for a long time just how much better Nintendo is than the competition, how much better manga is than the competition, and until just recently, it feels like the rest of the world just kind of was sneering at you, right? They just kind of refused to accept it. And now that Superman, one of the most overrated American pop culture figures of all time, a character who has contributed nothing to the overall cultural zeitgeist, who is only shoved in our faces to be kind of some subversive Jewish plant, Superman, pushing globalist propaganda, I give up my American citizenship for globalism, you have situations like that. And then you have One Piece, which is so far in the opposite direction, where it veers so far into like base territory that it's kind of unbelievable. You have Oda, talking about the elites and like the kind of nonsense they pull like decades ago. Like the Epstein files are basically like a real life version of the celestial dragon, of the celestial dragons. They're not even like exaggerated, really, which is like kind of the funny thing about it. And it's very interesting seeing One Piece kind of be seen as like this rallying point for revolutions all over the world. And I do mean all over the world, not in America, because that's kind of the thing we do need to talk about as Americans, is that like it's not enough to like have a revolution in our own country and overthrow our corrupt elites and like do away with them. We also need to like do away with the corrupt establishment in other people's countries as well. Like we need to get rid of all of these people, like dismantle the entire globalist like system and power structure. And One Piece, it feels like, is the piece of media that's really getting people on board with the idea, regardless of your political ideology or nationality. Like Attack on Titan is interesting because it's like about kind of like white genocide specifically, and like how like the powers that be are trying to destroy us and like destabilize us and blame us for everything. It's very nationalistic in that way, but like One Piece is more about like other people, like how everyone is kind of going through the same problems, and like I do think it's very important to think about as a whole, and I think that's why One Piece resonates so strongly with people around the world, because Oda has done such a great job creating all these different cultures like inspired by real world counterparts. You have like the Japanese, you have like Elbath, you have like like all this pulls from like real history and mythology, and it becomes so easy to like kind of associate it with like their real world counterparts. And at this stage, it really does feel like when you read something like Enies Lobby for the first time, you really get a sense of like what really resonates with people and what people really find important about this story. Okay, like all the leftist attempts to try and like say like this game is the series is somehow woke, or like a proponent of the cause, they just don't really hit like at all. Like all of it is just like it's just gaslighting people and just trying to downplay the reality of the situation. Is that like one of the most right-wing series ever is about to overtake Superman, who is like the very definition, the very symbol, I would say, of like Marxist globalist like control. Okay, like it is remarkable to finally see One Piece like get the credit and praise it deserves. And it's very interesting to see just how many people have failed to downplay this IP over the years. I know I haven't been talking about One Piece as much over the past 20 years as like the Nintendo thing, but like I do think One Piece is like yet another example of just why Japan has just kind of like led the charge when it comes to like getting across these kinds of ideas in media. The Marxists had control over like pretty much every piece of entertainment around the world except for Japan, and that's led to like stuff like this and Attack on Titan becoming very, very popular in spite of its rather problematic themes and ideas. It's very, very interesting, and I do think it's we're now at the point that we can safely say that like manga is better than comics because of this kind of material, because they push like such strong messages on people, because it resonates so strongly with people. Like this is the kind of thing that would never ever be published in American comics. Like they would not allow it, and that's why comics come off as preachy. It's why they come off as overly political. It's why they come off as pure propaganda, because they're not actually telling a story. They are trying to push a message, okay? As opposed to One Piece, where it's more about like, the adventure and like living your life and like, meeting people along the way, and just it's interesting, like how One Piece sets this up, because Luffy is kind of dismantling the world government without even really doing anything. Like that's that's the weird thing about this. That's the weird, crazy thing about Luffy is that he's not like the savior. The hero, like beating the world government. Like it's just kind of collapsing under its own weight and its own bullshit. You know what I mean? Because it's like other people he's meeting along the way that's kind of like kicking off like the world revolution while he goes like to the next island and does the same thing again. You know what I mean? It's remarkable to kind of see like how something like One Piece can resonate with like all sorts of different people for all sorts of different reasons, and like it really does just come down to the fact that it is just so much better than anything Superman has ever done. And I do think that like once Superman is kind of acknowledged as being kind of a joke character, and people are allowed to let like the meme die, like it'll be kind of universally accepted that One Piece is just objectively better than Superman, because Superman does not have the quality of One Piece. It does not have the depth. It does not have the complexity. You're talking about something that's had like hundreds of writers over the years with contradicting ideas and philosophies that just kind of are kind of like slammed together by like a corporate like globalist agenda to try and push this message that like leave the fighting to other people, bro. Like you can't do anything because you don't have superpowers. Like it's ridiculous. Okay, like it's odd how demoralizing and just how pathetic Western comics really are. And what we need to do is acknowledge just how dangerous this material is for kids. Okay, like Western comics are more than just bad. They're downright disgusting and really should be treated as such. Like there are no kids reading Superman comics today, but if there were, like they really should just be told that like read a real book. Read some One Piece, read some Lord of the Rings. Do something other than read something as poorly thought out, poorly conceived, and poorly executed as Superman.